We continue our exposition of the book of Romans. Today we arrive at verse 20. It reads as follows: For since the creation of the world, God's invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. In the last episode, we delved into this verse and examined the fact that God's manifestation, God's revelation, was not an afterthought. And so therefore, verse 20 begins by telling us that God's revelation started since the creation of the world. Since the book of Genesis chapter 1 verse 1, we see the manifestation of God. Since the world began, God started to reveal himself. I would like to do a theological exposition rather than a biblical exposition of verse 20. And so when we talk about since the creation of the world, when scientists see an opposition between God and science, and when they argue that the world created itself, what they really say, as C.S. Lewis would say, it is the assumption that if you shake a glass of milk and splash that milk on a wall, there is a high probability that the splashed milk on the wall would create a perfect map of London. But that is, of course, futile thinking. There is a designer behind all the creation. So the scripture therefore tells us that since the very first creation, when God started creating the heavens and the earth, when he started separating the waters and the firmament, when he started creating light and separating it from the darkness, that was more than just a mere creation. It was a manifestation of his attributes. And therefore, since the creation of the world, we are told God's invisible attributes are clearly seen. I spoke about that in our last episode, so I will skip that and go to the following phrase: being understood by the things that are made. I'm going to pick up two ideas here that are put forward. The first is the fact that God's invisible attributes are seen. That's a function of the sight. And then you have the second, which is being understood. Understanding is a function of the mind. And so God has so made himself known to the naked eye as he has to the mind of those that he has created. And therefore his attributes are both seen and they are also understood. And both the seeing and understanding of the attributes of God, they are derived from the things that are made. Therefore, in the book of Psalm chapter 19, we are told that the heavens declare the glory of God. I spoke about that also in the last episode. This is what John Calvin referred to as the grand theater of God's glory. The fact that God has manifested himself and the whole world tells of his glory. The whole world is a glorious theater, theatrum gloriae, as he would say in Latin. And therefore, when you see the flowers, the mountains, the seas and the waves as they crash on the seashore, when you see the rains, the galaxies, the stars and the moon and the sun, when you see animals that we cannot explain the source of their existence, we can only speculate. When we see this grandeur, all this creation, they all point to a grand designer. In the same way that when we see a beautiful bridge or when we see a beautiful tower, what comes to mind or what should come to mind is more than a wow of how beautiful it is. We should ask ourselves always, who is the designer? Who is the architect? And that is what science confuses, because it confuses the creation with the creator. When we see the beauty of the galaxy, of the nebulas and stars being born and others dying, when we see that beauty with the telescopes that we've made, and we see all these rockets that go to Mars and Jupiter and other planets, and we marvel at the creation, we shouldn't stop there. We should take a step further and wonder at the grand designer, the grand weaver, from whom all the beauty of the world that we witness emerge from. And so Paul tells us here, therefore, that he has revealed himself, this God, through the things that are made. He goes on to say that while the things that are made could reveal so many attributes of God, and therefore our idea of love is very much based on our idea of what flowers portray. And so that's part of God's revelation of what love really is. We calm ourselves with calm waters. We like to sit in quiet places, walking in the forests, so that we may just hear the birds squawk. And when they do so, it gives us a sense of authenticity and peace. But that's part of the character of God. That's God's idea. Flowers are God's idea. The sound, the beautiful sound of birds early in the morning, that's God's idea. When we love to go and retire on the side of the sea, or on the seashore, and enjoy the calm waters of the sea, that's God's idea. The calmness that we derive from His creation, there is a creator behind them all, whose idea they are. But here Paul tells us that more than the peace that we derive or love, which are part of God's characters, here Paul says that the creation clearly declare at least two attributes. And the first is God's eternal power, God's authority and explosive power. The fact that none of these things came to existence on themselves, that they have come to existence because there is a power behind them. Those who argue that the world threw itself into existence, or they support the idea of the Big Bang theory, the basic question always is where exactly or what caused the Big Bang. If it is true that the world exploded into existence, science, the same science tells us that nothing comes from nothing. Nothing must come from something. We also know that if anything has to move, if there is any motion, and when we talk about the Big Bang, we are talking about a motion from point A to point B. And when you talk about motion, there has to be an external force. What the same science tells us is referred to as kinetic energy. There has to be an external actor for the Big Bang to happen. It cannot sit still for all eternity at a point of singularity and never moving for the whole of eternity, and then one day explode into existence without any external actor. That is a logical nonsense. It does not make sense. Nothing moves without being acted on by external force. And so when we talk about God's eternal power, it is the force through and from which all things are created. That by His word, the Bible tells us, things that are not, that were not, became. Things that were not made, they were commanded to existence. And so here we learn that God's eternal power is clearly manifest in all of creation. But he also says that a second attribute that is manifested is God's Godhead, God's divinity, God's deity. The fact that when we see the creation of God, we know well that nobody else has any power to do so. And that being that made these things must be out of those things, must exist out of these things. And so from an apologetic point of view, our argument is that God was not created because he wasn't. If God was created, that which would have created God would have been greater than him. But God is self-existent. He has always been, and he always will be. And therefore we know that he is the one who is, who was, and who is to come. That the beginning found God existing, that he is self-existent. God is not even self-created. So let me put it in summary. There are three key arguments that are put forward from various apologists. The first is that God was created. And of course, we have rebutted that argument, because if God was created, he would not be God. The second argument that could be made is that God is self-created. But that is also logical nonsense, because what it would mean is that God existed before he existed. And that makes no sense, because if you're creating yourself, you have to exist before you exist for you to be able to create yourself. And therefore we are only left with the most logical explanation of God, who is self-existent. That God did not create himself, neither was he created. God is self-existent. And by that virtue, he is God. He has never been greater than he is. He will never be lesser than he is. He always will be what he always has been. This God, therefore, created the heavens and the earth and everything that is in it, as Paul would tell us in Acts chapter 17. And then finally, here you see that the fact that God has manifested himself throughout all generations, and the fact that all creations scream of the existence of this God, and they tell of both his eternal power and his deity, man is left without any excuse. That none of us would cry ignorance. None of us would say that I was never told about this God, and therefore I did not know about his power and deity. None of them would say, because I did not know this God, I turned to idols and ancestors, and I turned to worshipping of other gods. None would say that I was justified in creating an image that I would worship. We are left naked and bare before this God. We are left without any excuse. Judas will never have any excuse before God, neither will any son of man. And those who think that they will stand before God and ask or make an excuse of the fact that God could have revealed himself more, Scripture charges that they are without excuse. Bertrand Russell, one of the leading atheists of the 20th century, was asked what he would ask God if he met God face to face. And his answer, cringeworthy answer, was, I would have told him that he did not leave enough clues for us. He should have revealed himself in a greater way. But that excuse will be ruled out of order, dear brethren, because here we are told that we are without excuse, that every rock that we see, the soil that we step on, the breath that we take, they all tell of the glory of God. We are without excuse. It doesn't matter which part of the world you are born. It doesn't matter which generation you are born, but God has revealed himself through the general revelation of the creation, through the glorious theater that exists to tell of his glory. And therefore, none of the sons of Adam will ever stand before God and make a claim that I did not know God, because he did not reveal himself. That is out of order.